Very much for joining us again. I'm sorry for the short break. I will try to be better on keeping time. I was just telling Tamar that she was so much better at this than I am, but today it's me, so apologies. So what are we gonna hear now? We're gonna move to a panel that is, we call it Scales of Governance, and it's basically gonna be Yael and Avinoam's paper that ended up not being so much, I think, about scales of governance, but we can discuss that. So Yael Kurlander from TrafLab and the Tel Chai Academic College and Avinoam Cohen from the College of Management and TrafLab are going to talk about BLAs as sites of organizational institutionalization. And then we're going to have Marian Panizin that we were lucky enough to hear yesterday from the World Trade Institute discuss. So Yael and Avinoam, the floor is yours. I think Tamar already made you a host, but she's making you now. So you can start sharing screen. So thank you, guys.
Oh, I can't yet.
Now you can.
No, I can't. Great. Okay, hi everyone. And thanks for bearing with us. We'll also try to keep the times. So what I'll be presenting, what both of us will be presenting in the next 10 minutes or so, is the work looking at bilateral labor agreements and looking at through the comparison of two sectors in Israel, and we were, I think, privileged to be following Rebecca and Nona as they provided much of the grounds on which we are building. So what we will be, the crux of the argument is that we are looking at both the construction and agricultural sector, and what we will suggest is, although as we've heard just before the break, that agreements manage to sharply decrease illicit migration costs, there are variations across sectors. And what we will want to present and argue is that there is a difference the difference that relates to that, and it's work that follows both of our own previous work of Yael on migration industry, especially in the Thai-Israeli corridor, and my own on transformations in migration governments. So the purpose of this project, which is part of a set of joint projects, is looking at BLAs through trajectories of institutionalization processes at the meso level. That is the organization of the sector and its migration industry, or maybe we should better say its migration or their migration industries. So we want to bring in the structures, and we ask how BLAs contribute to the structuration or institutionalization processes in each of these sectors that we'll be looking at. And also, and that is, I think, in reference to some of the previous papers that we've heard in the last couple of days, what are the broader insights that can be generalized from specific case studies? So the opening assumption is that the regulation of temporary guest worker programs through BLAs should be examined in the overall context of employing non-citizens in a segmented labor market. That is not only looking through the workers that come through BLAs, but also more broadly, assuming that the processes of institutionalization shape the paths of different agreements, and that their transformative potential depends on their evolution and design as sites of institutionalization. So BLAs, they can trigger processes, they can become integrated in or reflect ongoing institutionalization processes. They can also remain detached from such processes. Our examples that we'll be discussing points mainly to the first two typological options here. So we follow Rebecca Reichman and Adriana Kemp in the work that has already shown in the Israeli context how the logics of meso-level actors and the structures contributed to the emergence and irregular migratory practices, including human trafficking. What we want to add to this is that we see sectoral variations within the national labor migration regime. In this paper, and maybe that could be broader later, we are looking at construction and agriculture, and we would argue that first, there are distinct trajectories of meso-level transformations that can be linked first to differences in anticipated scale levels. That is, while workers in construction are regarded as professionals and expected to arrive with specific skill sets, they're also tested for skills. And the agricultural sector does not expect specific skills or expertise. And we would also suggest that we see this in the function of meso-level intermediaries and also in the place of BLAs in sectoral processes of institutionalization. And the consequence of which is that the differential institutionalization path, it's a difficult word, is evident in changes in both the permit quotas in each sector and also the creation of bypasses for recruiting workers outside BLAs. And here I pass on this to the head.
Yeah, but you continue work with the PowerPoint. So the Israeli, you need to switch to the next slide. So the Israeli immigration and labor market policies were implemented through a combination of a permit and quota system, serving as a key regulatory method through which the government determined the scope, makeup, and employment domains of guest worker program. Examining more closely of the difference between quotas of overseas migrant workers shows the changes in the quotas in construction compared to that in agriculture. In both cases, however, the realities on the ground seems to contradict declared government policies of limiting the reliance on migrant labor. This is evident not only in the context of agriculture, where the stability of the quota does not overlap with a limited migration policy. In construction, where the government succeeded in reducing quotas from the 90 to 2000, as you can see, quotas have been rising since 2013. Next slide. The evidence accumulated since the entry of the BLA show a clear positive effect on explosive recruitment practices, as you saw with Nona and Rebecca. Where BLA were implemented, there has been a drastic reduction of recruitment fees, but additional paths were created that circumvent the regulatory reach of BLAs. In terms of the recruitment segment of the migration industry, the BLA implemented were path-breaking. The government became deeply involved in institutionalizing the migration recruitment process. The recruitment process anchored in BLA transformed previous practice by channeling workers to formal mechanisms that do not require additional illegal payment. On a closer look, however, the institutionalization of recruitment in agriculture and construction followed a different path. In agriculture, as the transnational ties of the private recruitment agencies were cut off, many of the agencies were taken out of business, and the number of Israeli placement companies dropped to less than a third, off with their head, as someone told me. The new recruitment mechanism introduced new actors to the migration processes, leading to a comprehensive reorganization of the meso-level. In the construction sector, it was different. The meso-level organization of the field was transformed earlier. It occurred in the internal domain. The established migration industry continued unabated as the number of companies remained relatively stable over the years, also after the bilateral agreement was implemented. While textual examination of BLA in agriculture and construction reveal only minor distinctions, the rules in institutionalization dynamic are not equivalent. Where BLAs in agriculture transformed and contract the migration industry, they did not have a similar effect in construction. Our assumption is that in construction, BLA facilitated the expansion of the guest worker program through a steady rise of the permit quota and diversification of the countries of origin to include China, Ukraine, and Moldova. In agriculture, by contrast, BLA had minimal impact on this aspect of migration policy. Thailand remained the main country of origin, and we have seen the quotas remain largely unchanged. Finally, In both sectors, BLA provide only partial coverage despite official policies that require all migrant workers to be channeled through BLA-based mechanism. Next one. Both in construction and agriculture, paths for filling empty rank of low-tier jobs were created long before BLAs were adopted. Yet, as they are preserved today, both programs bypass the formal policy of solo reliance on BLA for admitting migrant workers. In doing so, they are able to preserve problematic recruitment and employment practices in terms of prohibitive recruitment fees, de facto expansion of the sector-based quotas, and the reappearance of problematic bidding practices. For the agriculture trainee program, in real nature of these programs suggests that the students pay excessive migration fees, including of the form of tuition, while becoming de facto workers. Moreover, the entry into force to the Israeli-Thailand BLA seems to have accelerated the rise of the number of trainees working on agriculture, 700 to 4,000 in 10 years. In construction, the path for foreign construction companies to operate in Israel and foster their workers was opened in 1996 with the entry of Turkish-based company Yemeslar. 20 years later, in the wake of slow implementation of the BLA in construction, it became a model that was expanded to additional construction companies. A series of government resolutions affirmed this changed the method of regulating foreign companies from a government-to-government approach to a market tender-based approach. The number of posted workers more than doubled since 2017 to 2,600 by the end of 2020. The last slide. In this paper, we wanted to explore the place of BLAs in relation to institutionalization processes they induce or integrate in. I hope that we succeed to show that the meso-level organization of guest worker programs in agriculture and construction and the different path of institutionalization of these sectors within and outside the BLAs resist a simple classification of agreements. It suggests that context rather than text is the key for evaluating the benefit, limit, and difficulties of utilizing BLAs for the regulation of temporary programs of migrant labor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yael and Avinoam, for this fascinating paper that really takes us, pushes us, as you said, from text to context in many ways, to look at institutional actors in a way that I think many of us are doing, but maybe not in such a strong emphasis and a strong theoretical grounding as you guys did. So thank you for that. We will now hear Marian Panizin from the World Trade Institute that will discuss the paper. Thank you, Marian.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yael and Avinoam, for this very interesting paper and the very interesting presentation that focuses in on what I also think are the key research innovations in your paper. So their paper basically looks at bilateral labor agreements, not so much why do nations, or in this context Israel, sign into BLAs, but why BLAs matter within a broader context of labor migration. So I think their case is to look not so much deductively, but more inductively, what are the problems on the ground? So excessive recruitment fees, fraudulent recruitment practices, the posting of workers, which creates discrimination towards not only domestic workers' wages and working conditions, but also discrimination towards other migrant categories that moved through BLA channels. They also look at the problematic of using student and internship pathways as a way to fill the agricultural, the need for agricultural workers, the excessive tuition fees that Thai students pay to get access to Israel, and these fees are basically admission fees to the labor market. So they look at these sets of problems, and then they look at what the BLAs do or do not do, and whether there is an accessory agreement or some kind of mechanism that comes in. One which I found very fascinating is the public procurement agreement. So this interface between, in this case, not trade agreements, as Jennifer was talking about 2 days ago, trade agreements and migration, but public procurement, as in the case of the Ilmazlar Turkish construction company. And I don't think they have it yet in the paper, but with China, I believe that similar issues arise where you have foreign direct investors bringing in their own workforce through a public procurement agreement. In the case of Turkey, the good news is that Turkey is at least a member of the government procurement agreement of the WTO. So there are some safety nets and good governance mechanisms at play, but the same case would not be this, with China, who's still exceeding the WTO GPA. So I find it very interesting that their paper, it's titled BLAs as sites of organizational institutionalization. I would rather like the bypassing that you use, this label of BLAs, bypassing, and not only bypassing, I think that BLAs are also used to restore mechanisms of fair and ethical recruitment that the GPAs or other questionable practices have destroyed temporarily. So I think that their paper has a very nice two-dimensional sequential or approach, a two-time ex-ante ex-post function of BLA. So maybe this came to mind. You probably all know the paper Second Order Structure of Immigration Law by Posner and Cox from 2007. So I think one could really play a little bit more. When does the BLA intervene? At what, not only at what level, but also at what time? After a public procurement agreement to correct the negative effects of it, or in the Israeli-Thai agricultural case, it comes after illicit practices, the sort of the abuse of the student migration category and students becoming quasi-labor migrants, but without the same rights. So I think there's an interesting potential, a huge potential actually, to really develop this bypass versus restoration concept a little bit further. When you speak about the meso-level and the migration industry, for me, that was the part of the paper that was a little bit less clear. I understood that what you meant by migration industry in the case, very well actually in the case of the Ilmazlar, in the construction sector. I understood it less for the agricultural sector, and I know that Israel signed this year and last year a BLA on the care, for care workers from Georgia and Sri Lanka. And there I would also like to know who is the meso-level, what is the migration industry, or rather, are these maybe unproblematic BLAs? I mean, I have the impression that these BLAs for recruiting care workers from Nepal, Georgia, and Sri Lanka to Israel seem to me quite straightforward BLAs, but the problem is more in the agricultural sector and in the construction sector. So maybe adding this dimension of the care sector to the paper and fleshing it out. I know the paper was not finished when I read it, so, and I know that Avinoam and Yahel are going to integrate these case studies, but I was interested in them because also for the reason that Switzerland has a migration partnership with Sri Lanka and is also negotiating one with Georgia. And it's very interesting to see why traditional host countries like Israel and Switzerland are going for bilaterals with Georgia and Sri Lanka. And I think one of the reasons which the paper does not uncover too much is that they're both post-conflict societies, and in the case of Switzerland, at least, it was one way to bring down the numbers of asylum seekers from Sri Lanka, at least. And the Swiss agreement with Sri Lanka, what it does, and this comes through this, I want to come back to your paper, is that it frames the BLA, it's not a BLA, it's a migration partnership, but it frames it with the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, in particular 10.7. I think Piaziri mentioned it yesterday, and that is for me another way of how BLAs can intervene and promote actually fair and ethical recruitment of workers, is by referencing to the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. So that's it's more of a framing issue, but I think it's nonetheless important. And then, more out of curiosity, I think Ayushman mentioned it yesterday, and you talk a little bit in your paper about regularizations and the role of BLAs in regularizing. So that would be the ex post function, the BLA coming in to redress something. My question was, in the light of the COVID pandemic, several EU countries like Portugal, Spain, Italy, they started off into one-off across the board regularizations. Some were sector specific for frontline workers, but some, like in Portugal, were universal, because to also guarantee that irregular migrants got universal health coverage to contain the pandemic, not really to be nice to them, but really to protect the overall population. So just out of curiosity, I was wondering how if Israel is a country that promotes one-off regularization of workers, if it has a tradition of doing so or not. Switzerland, for instance, it's a hands-off scheme, never done it, will never do it. But because regularization practices do not necessarily need bilateral agreements. So you don't really need bilateral agreements to regularize status. I think in light of this COVID context, it might be nice to just have a discussion of that, but it doesn't have to be in this paper because we don't want to overload it. It's already very interesting. So just to conclude, for the migration industry, and I think we talked about it quite a lot the last few days with Rebecca and Jennifer and Jenna and Nicola. I think in your paper you introduced a new actor, which are foreign investors, and foreign investors as employers. And here, this ties back into the public procurement agreements. I think it would be really interesting to discuss their role and to see to what extent do public procurement agreements, to what extent can they be social, and to what extent can they do something for workers' rights, migrant workers' rights in particular. So in closing, I want to say that I really liked your argument of the bypassing, and I would encourage you to complement it maybe with an argument about the restorative effect of BLAs, to play a little bit more with the time dimension, and also to develop a little bit further these quasi-worker categories, this falling out of foreign students, foreign persons, from them falling out of the labor migration category and bringing them back in, and what this, what you do with it. So I'd be really curious to read another version, the next version of your paper, and if I'd be happy to comment upon it. And I think it's really fascinating work, and I think it holds a lot of promise to develop the nexus between public procurement and BLAs further. And I can see that Israel is maybe is probably a good case study. I'm wondering if there are others, but at least it seems that there is this ex post ex ante thing happening, which I have never seen happening anywhere else. So I think it's, you chose a very unique topic, and it has a huge potential for very unique research conclusions and theoretical framing. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marian. Thank you very much. So Yehiel and Avinom, would you like to respond before we open it up?
Yeah, you want me to pick up? Maybe I'll begin with a few.
Just if
so
you
thank you, Marian.
I'll just ask in advance to be brief, just because.
Very brief. I will not be able to address. We will not be able to address all these thoughts and comments. So I'll begin, I think, very briefly. The first is, I think that the ex post ex-ante exposed framework of Cox and Posner is indeed very relevant here. I think we are all expecting BLAs to provide an ex-ante, but if we recall Cox and Posner's argument, so that maybe that's not such a good idea. Indeed, Israeli agreements are expected to do ex-post, but we also, and the bypassing do the other way around. But we also see is that and it's very clear in agriculture, quotas remain. So in this respect, at least in agriculture, it's more of an ex post and an ex ante intervention, but it's also indeed a framework to think through. There is seldom regularization, and there are formal regularizations in Israel, especially in care work, in the care sector. There was also in construction and in agriculture, but not to the same extent, and more informal than in care. And last, and maybe Yehiel will want to follow. There's more to think of, but just to say that it's interesting. So you were looking at Turkey as a country that is party to the public procurement agreement of the WTO, but Ilan Solar is a very problematic employer, and actually Gilad quoted a petition against workers of Ilan Solar in conditions of human trafficking. And I think it actually raises question on the extent to which a trade perspective is indeed helpful in thinking through migration and human mobility issues here. But it is something that we did not look at, and it's worthwhile thinking also through. Yehiel, do you want to add before?
I will just add about the migration industry, and that's I think that one of the things we try to show in the article is that the idea is that the migration industry is here to stay. It's been there, it's here and it's going to stay. And the idea of the BLA, it's very concrete. I mean, coming after Rebecca and Nona is wonderful because they really made everything much more clear when they told us it's mainly about the recruitment. And we showed, I think we looked at those two sectors and we said, like, what happens with the migration industry? In agriculture, it transformed totally. All the time, recruitment companies were, out of business, and placement companies in Israel was really reducing. Now, it didn't happen the same in construction. It has nothing to do with the quota even. And only looking about those two figures made my sociological imagination, as you say, like go wild. How come? How come it happened? What is the BLA did? I mean, it no more fees anymore, great success. We are so overwhelmed. But what happened with the migration industry? How does it go? And by expanding those views and looking about where was the bilateral agreement entered, in what kind of path in the institutionalization, made us begin to realize about those different paths that we try to analyze in this article.
Thank you. So we'll start with Tamar.
Okay, so excuse me if this is a little half-baked, but you got me thinking, and I think there's something very interesting that we've now seen in several places where BLAs do negative regulation, right? So they create these spaces that both workers and employers and maybe recruiters choose to avoid, right? So they create this institutional or this sort of formal process, and then as Jennifer's comment made clear earlier, these are inconvenient or just are not right for various reasons, both for the workers and, as you show, also for employers who try to circumvent these processes and go elsewhere. So that got me thinking that part of what we've been seeing here is that we have to take a closer look at the sort of the dark side of the moon, right? If the BLA is the light side, then we need to look at the negative spaces as well. And I think you've done that. I mean, you show us exactly the vacuums that are in a way generated or sort of expanded by the regularization that BLAs do. And I think that's very helpful even in pushing us in that direction. So thank you for that.
So maybe I'll ask two quickly and just say that I think it's a really fascinating paper, and the comparison between agriculture and construction is so rich, and I think can be and should be richer, as I already told you, in the next drafts, because I know you have the knowledge of a unique knowledge of the inner workings of this meso level. I do want to ask you about something that is not highlighted in the paper and kind of follows up on what Jennifer Gordon asked earlier about the kind of the preference, the things that work for migrant workers, even if they don't seem to work in the system. Maybe it follows up a little bit on Tamal as well. And one, I think a big difference between construction and agriculture is informality, right? In construction, and Rebecca and Nona mentioned it earlier, there is a huge underground, it's not that secretive, but a huge informal sector where workers actually get paid much more because they work in informal ways. And that doesn't exist in agriculture. And this is, again, something that the BLA didn't touch. And I think theoretically, maybe it could have touched. I don't know. I would love to hear your thoughts about that. I will say that this informality really plays in some ways, and just from this article that I'm writing, this other article I'm writing with Asaf about the cracks in the system with Asaf Bondi, that the kind of this crack in the system that allows informality actually allows much higher wages for construction workers outside of Ilma's law, right? Like except in those execution companies, and the same doesn't exist for farm work. And I was always interested in how come it's not the case, because there's such a high demand for farm workers as well. So I don't know. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that informality and the role of the BLA within that, and whether the meso level is part of that. Thank you.
I believe it's the thing about the skill. I mean, my answer is very clear about your question. I mean, the informality of the construction workers, they are very skilled. They pass exams to come here, and they have the specific professions, and the informality is really going to another site, right? I mean, they take them to another site, or they work, in the other hours. Now, in the idea of the farmer is that everybody can do it. It's less skilled. So if you have the season of something, you will bring Israeli workers, or you will bring Thai workers for somewhere else, which is a practice that is happening. So this informality is less needed in a time, like in a specific time, or in a different area to come and take it. This is my thought about it. And I think the idea of the skill make a lot of difference in the sectors and in the way those norms are shaped. Maybe Avinam would like to give another hypothesis.
I think a short follow-up on that is so skill and wages. So the wages are higher. There is more to share. So there are more intermediaries that can live off that, and I think that also explains part of why we see the meso level less touched at the construction sector than at agricultural sector.
I want to say out of this question that about the trainee, the student for agriculture, Hani Ben Israel and Ila Shamir and myself are writing an article about all this aspect, only dedicated to this idea, and so keep in mind.
Marian and then Adam.
Thank you. On this construction worker, how many foreign companies operate construction work in Israel? I mean, how much of the sector is run by non-Israeli companies?
There's a difference between number and between the share of the work. So there are 9 companies, and the share and the numbers are around 2,600. That's the latest figures that we've seen. But apparently, the share of construction work that they do is more significant than their percentage of workers. So they do infrastructural work that is significant in the sector itself, but I cannot say much more than what I've said so far. But this is something to look into.
Yeah, because then when they bring in they employ foreign workers, or they bring their own workers with them, then the investment that they do acts in some ways as collateral. So the risk of employing the migrant worker is still rests with a foreign investor. And this is why, for instance, in the WTO context, a lot of countries that offer mode 4 commitments, they only offer them in sectors where the other country offers to them mode 3, sort of, which is investment commitments, so that you have this collateral, this financing secured. And so this might be an explanation also for why in the construction work there's such a difference than with agriculture. Thanks.
Thank you, Marian. Adam?
Hi. So I liked the comparison of the construction and the agricultural industries, and also the discussion of how there resulted in the bypass of the BLAs. The thing that, this isn't directly on point, but the thing that this had me thinking about is that so much of the focus with BLAs seems to be trying to mandate shifting of costs. So the BLAs say the recruiter can't pay this, the worker shouldn't pay it, the recruiter should pay it, or the employer should pay this, or the business should pay that, etc. And while trying to shift the costs, they also raise the cost, which is they add these layers of bureaucracy. So the net cost of migration might actually be higher with the BLA. But of course, cost shifting never really works, because to the employer, this person's labor is worth X amount, and they don't care whether or not they pay some of that to the worker or some of that to the recruitment fee, whatever. They're just willing to pay X amount for the labor. So either way, the money is coming from the worker. It just depends on at what stage it does, wages or after. This is all to say the lead up of your paper really, to me, highlights that the emphasis has been in so many places in the wrong place, and that the emphasis should have been on how do we reduce the cost of labor migration instead of trying to mandate shifting it and make it sort of cheaper to employ agricultural or construction workers in a fair way, not just trying to like add this layer of bureaucracy, because as you guys document, it's just going to be sort of bypassed if you just try to mandate these policies. And it reminds me on some of the discussions, for instance, yesterday or maybe the day before, on the high costs for US-Mexico migration. So everyone just skips the formal process, even though we add layer and layer of protections for like migrant workers from Mexico, doesn't matter because it's just too expensive. Anyway, this also say the on fees and the bypassing, I think, are really useful ways to help get at the limits of the effectiveness of BLAs.
Thank you, Adam. So Yael and Avinom, if you want to quickly respond.
Yael, you want to add, or?
I will be first. I think it's not only about the money. I mean, it's always about the money. It's always about the money, and but it's not only about the wage and the recruitment. I think it's also about the binding. I mean, bringing back the binding. As someone told me, one of the employer let's bring back slavery. Why they took slavery? I mean, he said it cynically, but I don't know. Let's just say. I mean, the idea of the bilateral agreements also, I mean, binding in Israel supposedly was ended in 2006, de facto not very much, but the idea that they did not pay the recruitment fees really, engaged their agency in moving and rights and blah, 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 everything that Nona and Rebecca said. And the idea of bringing it back so strongly, especially in the foreign construction companies, but also in the agriculture student, makes me think that there are more than that. It's not just the money that they pay, it's also the way that you treat the worker as worker who are binded to work in a specific, I mean, as a product. That's just my comment.
Just I'll add to that. So the other way of doing that is or think about it is also the potential of raising the cost of the products. And here there's also a significant difference between agriculture and construction. And Ilah will probably think of that as a fee, but the potential of raising the cost of products there's a great difference between construction and agriculture. So even if you manage to reduce the cost at the sending end, as was demonstrated by the Israeli agreements, I think that the rise in the prices of housing is also potentially part of what we've seen in the context of construction, and that probably is something which is not only an Israeli story. So there's more to share also in that respect. And that also translated to higher recruitment fees in the last 2 decades until the BLAs came into full implementation and construction.
So thank you very much, Yael and Avinoam, and thank you very much, Marian, for your comment. This was very, very interesting and really adds another dimension, I think, to the discussion we had so far.